All right.
All
Hi,
right.
everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
So this is this is Mind Clear Psychotherapy, and we're all here to talk about nerdy psychological stuff. And today we're going to talk about denial, projection, and self-criticism, right? All right. Something that every one of us experiences, some unfortunately more so than others. And it comes up a lot. So with no further ado, I'll start off. A question to all of you. When it comes to denial, what are some common consequences of denial that you find people might experience in the work that you do?
So the way I'm viewing it is going to be where consciously or unconsciously you are basically disowning or not like you're creating a separation between maybe uncomfortable feelings, emotions, experiences, truths, again, like just you're creating a distance between and not spending time with maybe the reality of your situation or the reality of your feelings.
You're in denial.
You're in denial.
When you said conscious or unconscious, as a defense, it would be inherently unconscious, no? And it's like I would say it's like a way of not perceiving or not accepting a reality that's like intolerable.
I think if you've heard the word denial, we're talking about what you think we're talking about.
I'm thinking about blind spots, and how a blind spot could potentially be perpetuated, or multiple blind spots be perpetuated from denial.
And how could that create problems for a person?
I think it limits their awareness of kind of their complete picture, or the complete picture of themselves, or maybe what's happening around them. And if you don't have a complete picture, then if you're missing information or missing parts, it's going to, I mean, it could create confusion, I guess, further denial, I'm thinking, and just a general sort of lack of, I think the less awareness a person has, the less ability they have to understand things, and yeah, just to be able to kind of like understand and work on the things that they are trying to tackle in therapy or in life.
Adding on to that, I would, sorry, Angela.
It's okay.
I would say also because of not having the full picture, you might find yourselves in situations, relationships that ultimately end up maybe recreating an abusive environment, a trauma bond, but ultimately, if you're not aware of it fully, you might end up in experiences that are reconfirming maybe your trauma, your abuse you experienced in the past.
Yeah, I was thinking about it in terms of like emotions and feelings, and maybe if you are not really aware entirely of what an emotion or a feeling feels like and you're in denial of it and it keeps coming up for you, then you can't recognize it right away, and that could have further impact.
What would be the consequence of not being able to recognize your emotion?
Consequences that it gets kind of covered up with a different emotion or a state sometimes, and it complicates things. So for example, if you were denying anger, you might find that you're oftentimes feeling like really guilty about things and not understanding that actually the guilt is masking the anger. Or
maybe you find that you start acting out in some kind of way. I don't feel angry, I don't feel angry, but you don't know why you're doing something.
Yeah.
Or why you've suddenly lashed out, or you're being passive aggressive in some kind of way, or you're avoiding something, or creating a problem and not even aware that you're creating a problem, but it's all stemming from the fact that you're denying that you're angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking how like emotions do come out eventually. And so it might come out with that acting out behavior, and also sometimes would you consider it like displacement at times? Like you might be displacing the anger into potentially eating junk food instead of having a balanced meal. Like, would that be a place where you might?
Well, that wouldn't be displacement per se, but it would be a form of acting out, sure, where you're acting out the anger towards yourself
Mm-hmm.
instead of whatever it is that you were angry about in the first place. I was just going to say that's a common thing behind people who are chronically depressed is denying their anger and often turning it against themselves or acting it out in some kind of way to the point that they shut down or
Right.
I also think sometimes a consequence could be if you're living in denial, you inevitably end up denying other people's reality too.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
I imagine that at least from what I see often is it leads to a lot of conflict. And then the person not understanding why they're in conflict and why people are so mad at them.
Mhm.
Because they don't even know that they're in denial. They don't know that they're denying somebody else either. Uh, and so it's just
Mhm.
very confusing why people are constantly mad at you.
Yeah.
Right.
I have a question that's kind of on the flip side of what we were talking about, but it's like, how does denial serve
Yeah.
individuals as a protective mechanism or a defense mechanism?
My question as well, Angeli.
Yeah. My question for all the defenses also. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine specifically with denial, right? It can be very helpful in childhood, right? When you're a kid and there's these really difficult situations surrounding you, it if you can deny them, it allows you to continue developing, right? It allows you to continue, you know, in this normal development. Um, and also as adults, when we're faced with trauma, denial can be helpful. I think in the aftermath of traumatic event and being able to move forward.
Yeah, in the short term for sure, right?
Mhm.
That didn't hurt me. I wasn't
Mhm.
bothered by that.
Mhm.
Very common response in the immediate aftermath of trauma, which does allow them to then do whatever needs to be done in the moment of crisis.
Mhm.
I think also denial is um, can be very helpful if you've been shamed a lot.
Mhm.
So growing up maybe in a situation where you were constantly criticized or emotionally abused and made to feel like you're just a terrible person, being in denial of your quote unquote bad qualities can help you maintain some sense of self or selfhood
Mhm.
um, in the short term anyways.
My question was going to be about was Angeli's, but I also kind of made a few more. And the other one was like, what are some experiences or experiences growing up or childhoods that might lead to someone having denial as a defense mechanism? I know you just kind of answered that, but I suppose we can go a little bit more into that.
For sure, if you've been given the message that something about you or your experience is bad or wrong, and what are you going to do with that? You can't literally not have anger, let's say, right? We talked about being in denial of anger. You can't not have anger. You can't not be you, but you can deny that those things exist,
Mm.
right? So I think constantly getting the message that something fundamental about you or your experience is wrong or bad is a key thing.
Mhm.
I mean, I was just thinking like any kind of traumatic event, like a loss, like a parent dying or, something like an accident.
Why might the loss of a parent or an accident lead to denial?
I think it's just so overwhelming to this, the system and I mean the individual.
So loss and accidents and things like that are part of most people's lifespan.
Mhm.
So what do you think it is? Now I'm usurping your question and trying to get you to be more specific. What do you think it is though about those experiences that would lead one to need to deny it? Because most people would not end up with denial for something like loss or an accident
Uh-huh.
versus like sexual abuse or something like that
Right.
that is abnormal.
Mhm.
I guess
Yeah.
I'm um, I'm just wondering if I feel like I'm kind of going back to the emotional stuff, but if certain feelings, like let's just say anger again, because it's always such a good example, but if certain feelings are not being acknowledged or haven't been processed, and then there's this sudden loss.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about that in terms of, yeah, like kind of if an emotional um, if an emotion hasn't been processed and that gets kind of severed and suddenly and it's kind of you're left almost, I'm thinking about shock or just like you kind of frozen in that place, and in order to be able to kind of live with that denial could swoop in and make you feel like it didn't happen.
Yeah, I think the key factor there is the interpersonal relationships. It's not about the event per se, and really we could say that even about something like sexual abuse. It's not about the event per se, it's about the key relationships in your life and how people around you respond to it.
Mhm.
And if,
Okay.
a terrible thing to lose a parent when you're a child, or be in a terrible accident or certainly sexual abuse. But if the people around you are responding in a way that is open and curious and caring and supportive, odds are that you're going to move through it in a different kind of way than in an environment where you're met with resistance or blame or shame or somebody else's denial, uh, which is what we often see when people are experiencing a lot of denial and other things.
Yeah. It's like you can go through a traumatic experience and not be traumatized depending on how people respond to you, but depending on how people respond, it can lead into becoming traumatized.
Mhm.
Well, I just wanted to add, like, when you're talking about these events, I think it's important to talk about them, the formation of denial during events in childhood, right? So when you talk about, the death of a parent, right? Children have this fear of being alone in the world. And if you're not supported by the adults around you, becomes intolerable. It's the most intolerable for a child. And so that's just important to think about how these defenses are developed during, these phases, earlier phases of life.
Mhm. I think push come to shove though, awful enough circumstances in adulthood, we can also
Yes,
face them, like if you're
absolutely.
a prisoner of war or,
Right.
uh, you know, war in
Mhm.
war, things that I think some other things like a domestic violence situation is a little bit more complicated because probably there was already childhood stuff
Right.
that might have contributed to
Hmm.
in that situation in the first place. Whereas like war suddenly broke out in New York City and it's prolonged, right?
Hmm.
If something like what's happening in Palestine and Israel, uh, that is bound to eventually traumatize everybody. And
Right, right,
um, um, yeah,
right. And where you don't have access to
to
these other
support
forms of, uh, right, protecting yourself or resourcing or, yeah.
because everybody is in extreme suffering and panic,
Hmm.
and at some point there's just nowhere to turn anymore.
Hmm.
Um, so these defenses could also potentially
Absolutely.
be built up in adulthood too. It just tends to be much more common
Hmm.
during these developmental phases and uh, when we really rely on other people so much for our survival.
Mhm.
And our brain is newly being formed.
Right.
Should we move on to projection?
Who wants to define it?
Well, that was part of my question on this one, because this one is actually hard to define. We also don't need to define self-criticism. We all know what self-criticism is. Uh, but projection is a confusing one because a lot of people will get kind of even angry at the idea of it because it sounds like some magic hocus pocus kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, uh, especially if we got into projective identification, which we will not do today. But um, so I think maybe all of us could take an opportunity to, in your words, how would you describe projection to a client?
I see it as putting often unconscious. Is it always unconscious? That's my question. Is it always unconscious, or is there potential sometimes conscious? We'll pause on that. But there is putting what you're experiencing, your fears, your feelings, maybe again, those potentially disowned feelings, fears, um, beliefs onto another person.
Angeli, how would you describe projection to a patient?
I'm trying to find a different way to frame it.
But just your words, it still is, right? We're all talking about the same idea. So, but just what words how would you say it?
I guess I would define projection as like something uncomfortable that you're feeling internally that you're then like placing on someone else or a different situation so that it doesn't feel quite so intense for yourself.
Hmm. That one sounds a little bit more like displacement.
Hmm.
Maybe sub question B is what's the difference between projection and displacement? But let's first keep trying to define projection. Juliet, how would you define projection?
I was gonna call on Megan.
Well, she's next, so
Displaced.
I would say projection is putting one's feelings onto another because they are intolerable or unacceptable in some way. And I think actually now that I'm thinking about denial is a part of it. I mean, they're all connected, but
all connected.
denying one's own feelings and almost, yeah, it's like, I was gonna say accusing, but accusation could come out of projection perhaps, but yeah, just placing one's feelings onto another because they are intolerable. I'll leave it at that.
I don't know. I guess it's projection would be a defense mechanism to recognize like an impulse or a trait or a feeling in someone else that is unacceptable to themselves, like, or when they, to not recognize it in themselves, to transfer it onto them.
Does the other person actually have that trait or impulse or experience in the scenario?
They might or might not. I mean, it's about not recognizing in yourself when it's coming up for you, perhaps, or
Then how's that different than denial?
oh, mhm. Because it's a way of not recognizing something about yourself that you find unacceptable.
That's denial.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
Is it because you're still like experiencing it,
Mhm.
but like
Right, right, right.
onto someone else, like you're still experiencing that, but not recognizing it within yourself?
I think some examples might be helpful here, because oftentimes projection is often about the other person is not actually having that experience, or right. If
Okay.
I see somebody if I'm angry, but I don't like that I get angry, that's the example we keep using. And so if I'm in denial about my anger and I see somebody else actually displaying anger, I might hate that person. How dare they get so angry? And now I'm denying their right to be angry, but that's not projection. That person is actually demonstrating anger. That's just one step further from denial. Or if I feel, I think it was just the wording of yours, Angeli. If I feel uncomfortable about the fact that I feel angry, I'm not in denial about it. I just feel uncomfortable with my anger. Displacing it is to then be like, well, but I'm going to be angry at this thing over here. I'm not angry at you, Angeli. I'm angry at Jenna because Jenna is a safer object for me to be angry at. That's displacement, but it's still mine. But now I feel more comfortable with it because Jenna is a safe object to be the recipient of my anger, whereas you're not. That's what I don't know if that's what you intended, but when you worded the way you worded it, it sounded like you were describing that. Whereas projection is like, Angeli, you're sitting there with a completely neutral face, and I'm seething with anger over here, but I'm in denial about it. And I look at you and I'm like, you're angry, Angeli. And you're just sitting there like, what? You just said you were angry at me. This happens a lot too. Like somebody will actually hear you say something that you didn't say because they're already in their head so convinced that this is happening that they're having an argument in a split second with you that their brain is registering it as if you actually even said it. And I'll be like, you just said that you hated what I just said. And you're like, I'm literally just sitting here trying to define projection. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think I was describing displacement.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm thinking about how you interpret people's facial expressions depending on how you're feeling. And like you kind of interpret the world through where you're at. And a
Hmm.
lot of times you might be like, God, they're such jerks, like because you're feeling really angry.
Hmm.
They're just people walking slow. They're not jerks, but like because you're putting your anger, your rage onto other people.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I think that's a great point too, that all of these defenses, we all have them.
Mhm.
Every single one of us has been in denial about something at some point. Every single one of us projects from time to time. And usually when it's a situation that, or a person that we don't know, the more neutral it is, the less we know, the more likely we are to project.
Do
Which
you,
is how the Rorschach test works, right? You have a ink blot that could be anything, and
Right.
you're projecting your world, your experiences onto this blobless image. And it tells a lot about what's going on in your head, whatever it is that you put onto that image, right? And sorry, Angela, you were going to say something?
well, what you were just saying, Jenna, is making me think of people who have like resting B-word face. And if that is like this, is that projection then? If you're just like looking at someone and it's actually just like a neutral face that they have on, like walking down the street, and then you just assume that they're like angry or upset.
Not necessarily, because our brain is always trying to make calculations of things, and certainly being able to assess whether or not somebody is angry at us is a survival mechanism. And so if somebody really has an angry look on their face, our brain is going to want to process that because that could be a danger.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily projection, especially if I'm not feeling angry at all, or I'm not having any kind of a thing, and I see somebody who appears to have an angry look on their face. That's not projection. That's an assumption, but not necessarily projection. But if I'm angry at the world and in denial about it, or if I'm so used to people being angry at me, or if I've grown up in a abusive household where somebody's constantly about to fly into a rage at any moment, and then I look at just any Joe Schmo and I'm like, that person's angry, that person's about to erupt in anger. Now we're getting into projection, especially the more I'm certain about it.
Mhm.
But oftentimes, if you guys can think about some of the work with our clients, is it's not just a feeling. There's usually a whole story to it. You think I'm stupid, right? That's not just a random assumption. That's a projection because it's your own narrative. It's something that's been told to you over and over again, and now you're projecting it onto somebody else, and you're hearing them say something that they aren't saying, or you're mind reading and assuming that they're thinking this thing. You're projecting your own fears or insecurities into somebody else in that way.
Narratives.
That's making me think about, so that example, like someone is saying to somebody else, accuses them of thinking that they're stupid. I was thinking about projection. I mean, it could be both, but like if I think I'm stupid, I believe that about myself. That's part of my narrative.
Mhm.
That an example of projection with that would be that I think you're stupid, right?
No,
No, that's just,
that's complicated, more
yeah,
complicated than this conversation.
you're like, that's just wrong.
But that's where we get into projective identification.
Right, okay,
Right.
we're not doing that today.
That's 3 steps removed. It
Right,
involves projection, but it's more than just projection. It's projective identification.
yeah. Okay.
That's the advanced series.
I'll
Part
be in a
two.
podcast in 3 months.
Stick around.
It's more if I
Yeah.
think I'm stupid and I then say, you think I'm stupid, that's straight up just projection.
Right, okay, makes
You
sense.
must be thinking the same thing I'm thinking.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can projection be used as a way to avoid conflict?
Can you say more?
Like if you have an angry feeling, might you project it onto someone else to, if you're like really afraid of conflict in some way, like,
I would argue that it's more the shame of feeling like you're not supposed to be angry.
okay,
Because if you're putting the anger onto somebody else, you're still creating conflict.
right.
Somebody's still angry in that situation.
Mhm,
Still conflict. So
mhm.
I don't know if what do you guys think?
Right, yeah. Maybe that wasn't a good example. The anger, yeah, just thinking.
Well, I
But
guess, go on.
Mhm.
go ahead, Jenna.
No, because mine is veering in a different, like, I'm veering a bit, so if yours is related.
So still want to talk about self-criticism, and since Megan just criticized herself, it seems a good moment to move into it.
Yeah.
Self-criticism. Why do you guys think people use self-criticism as a defense?
Megan, why don't you go first?
Oh, why, I wonder me, why me? Well, this comes up a lot in the work that I do with people, sort of helping people to understand how their inner self-critic might be trying to help or protect them in some way. Um, and we get really curious about it. And often people talk about the ways that they use that as a way to motivate them into action. I think a lot of us have an understanding that if we're really hard on ourselves, it will get us moving. Another way I think it could be protective is to give us a sense of control. That if we blame ourselves, it's easier than thinking that we might not have control over things. And also thinking about another way I'm thinking about how it can be protective. I wrote this down actually. Sorry, give me a second. Edit. Yeah, to really to keep us safe, I think. Self-criticism can, if don't do this, it can come off sounding very harsh. Our inner critic can be very harsh, but it may be a way of getting us to avoid situations that historically have been very harmful to us.
Mm.
Right? Like, don't speak up in the meeting, you're stupid. Right? Maybe speaking up in your home growing up was met with pretty dire consequences. So it can sound like the inner critic is just being really cruel, but perhaps there's a concern there that you'll be in harm's way, and that's how it's communicated.
I might argue though that it's not a but, it's an and.
Yeah, yeah.
It might sound cruel, and it is.
Yes.
And also it's there to protect, it was formed to protect,
Yeah,
but that's not to deny that it's also cruel.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's also maybe related to, yeah, anger that you turn against yourself that you weren't able to express, not having access to that sort of protective anger.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Angela.
same, like thinking a lot about the word control there and also how it kind of controls the narrative that maybe that you think other people could have of you. So if you're quick to criticize, even if it's out loud, then at least no one else has said it and it like
Mm.
might land a little softer, even though it is cruel and intrusive and hurtful to yourself, having it internally instead of like externally placed on you.
It's making me think of Noelle's example about comedians. And sometimes comedians, if they often will go and make fun of themselves,
Right.
maybe because they were bullied when they were made fun of. So instead they now do it to themselves and it's now their control of it.
Mhm.
Self-deprecating humor.
The problem, of course, is that we always treat other people the way we treat ourselves, whether we believe it or not. No matter how in denial we might be of that fact, it is a fact. And so
Right.
the more cruel we are to ourselves, we are also being cruel to other people, even if it's passively or indirectly, uh, or sometimes making other people take responsibility for your cruelty in a way. If you want to go back to projective identification, which we never even defined, but still, that's where that comes into play. Um, you know, all of these defenses are protective in one way and incredibly destructive in another. And that's the tough thing about it, is that it is protective, and also at some point it stops being protective and it actually is your own worst enemy
Right.
thing. And I think the thing with self-criticism in particular, which is so difficult, is the first thing you mentioned there, Megan. We live in a particular society, a particular culture. You know, most of the world doesn't operate the way that the USA does. Uh, and we are one that it's drilled into you from day one, you know, that somehow punishment and harshness and cruelty is what is supposed to motivate us. Uh, uh, we live in a very punitive society. Verbally, physically, our systems are very punitive. And the thing is study after study after study has shown that actually it doesn't work. Punishment really doesn't work. It just makes people scared and angry and more likely to mess up and act out and et cetera, et cetera. Juliet, you get the last word.
Self-criticism as a defense. I had to think about that. That is not one that, I mean, I certainly know what it is, but I honestly didn't list it in my mind as a defense mechanism. But I certainly understand everything that's being said, and not sure I have much to add to it. I think, I mean, it's something I see happening a lot with people that I work with, and what stands out about it to me is the kind of repeating of, I think, what has been told to the
Right.
person, that I mean, maybe that's getting into projective identification again, but these negative thoughts that someone is experiencing about themselves feel is born out of the experience they're having from an abusive person, usually an adult in childhood,
Yeah.
in my experience with people.
Becomes internalized.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been fun. Till next time.
Back for the next month.